see. Let's sit here. Just go here now. Well, I think yesterday we tried to have some introduction, not so much into the material aspects of the games, but into the character of the Greeks and why they were as they were. And of course, everything we hear today, and particularly everything we hear tomorrow, will come from that extraordinary, unique character which valued the individual, which encouraged competition, and which honored achievement, but not with money. The goal was to win, and the goal was to achieve. So I've called this Everyday Life in the Agora, but we're not really going to be in the Agora very much. I want to tell you more about the lives of ordinary Greeks. That's really what it's about. And it's extraordinary how ignorant people are. I noticed on some American exam papers that Greeks were considered to be very sculptured people, and they built the apocalypse. They also had myths, and their myths were apparently female moths. But one of their myths was about Achilles, who his mother dipped him into the river Styx until he was intolerable. Anyway, I'm going to try and put some of that right. And I know that's not true of any of you, and certainly not true of any of my wonderful students. So, when I say Greeks, I'm really going to be talking today primarily about the Athenians. And when you think that almost all the things that we value, which include mathematics, algebra, tragic drama, painting, vase painting, stagecraft, democracy, all of these things came from Athens, right? That's Athens, not the other cities. So we think about the Greeks, let's think about what they did. First of all, they were island people, they were seafaring people. Now, we are seafaring people in Cape Town, in a sense. And they lived with and for and on the sea. And the earliest journey that we know about is the journey of Odysseus, as he came back from the Trojan Wars. And he got lost. It took him about 10 years to get home. Here we see him tied to the mast of a rather tubby little ship, and he is listening to the voice of the sirens, which was very dangerous. So he had the ears of his heteroi, his companions, stuffed with wax. But I'm rather more interested in this ship that he's sailing. These Bronze Age ships, they had a fixed mast and a fixed sail, so you really could only use the wind if it was behind you. They had to row, do most of their traveling by rowing. You can see that it also has an eye here, which of course ships even today in Greece will have. Now, they weren't just island hopping people, although of course they did a lot of that as well. And when they went off on journeys from one island to another, taking amphora of oil, or taking grain, or taking their families or their sheep, they would sometimes take a puppy or a monkey with them to while away the time and to entertain them on voyages. But I want to tell you about really a much more adventurous voyage. First of all, let's look at the map. So this is roughly the map at the time of Herodotus. And you can see that they've got Italy's quite good, you've got Sicily, and that's quite good, Sardinia. You've got most of this fairly good, but it goes very vague when you get beyond the Pillars of Hercules. And this is in the time of Herodotus. So this wonderful man, Pythias, there you can see him, he set sail from Provence. Now, in Marsilia, which is Marseille, there was a very famous school of philosophy, which rivaled the great schools of philosophy in Carthage. You need to remember that the whole Mediterranean, all of this was Greek. Cyrene, please turn off your phones. Sorry. Cyrene, Carthage, and these great cities were Greek. So he came from Marsilia, and he went out bravely to the unknown, and he is the first person that's thought to have seen the Northern Lights. He went so far north that he reported the sea was solid. The sea was solid. He went up to Iceland. He was the first person to circumnavigate the British Isles. He was probably the first person to sail around Ireland. All of this in a very limited ship with absolutely no navigational aids whatsoever, and almost certainly all by astral navigation. I'm going to be talking a bit about the stars tomorrow, because the stars have a very important role to play in the building of the Parthenon. So Pythias does this enormous, wonderful adventure in the 4th century. But the ships that you would see in the Mediterranean would be merchant ships like this one, and the ship like that, the hull would be lined with lead in order to keep the cargoes dry. And remember, it's an island. There are islands. It's scattered everywhere. Most of them were rocky with nothing on them. They relied on grain coming in, primarily from Egypt, but also oil and other things coming from other places. So trade across the Mediterranean was absolutely vital, and these ships were rather slow, which made them very susceptible to piracy. Now, piracy was practically an economic necessity in some of the islands, and particularly the island of Samos. I'm sure you've all heard about Pythagoras. Yes, lots of nodding. Pythagoras came from Samos. Samos was an island that produced great engineers, but it also produced great pirates, and piracy was a big issue. It was one of the reasons that Athens became so powerful, because Athens had the naval power, and the triremes of the Athenian navy patrolled the sea, a bit like the Royal Navy patrolling the world in the 19th century. So here is a pirate ship, and as you can see, it's got a very, very long battering ram with nasty serrations on it, and is about to ram that ship. If I could just go back one. Oh no, that's not what I wanted to show you. We're going to go on. So here we are. This obviously it's much lighter. The trireme, the boat would go very fast, and we had piracy as a big issue. Now this one here is a slightly different kind of boat. It's got a ladder. The ladder was for boarding other ships and for landing, and you can see the sails are black. And I wanted to make one little point about the black sails. Most of these Bronze Age ships, they had brown sails or black sails, right? That's probably not a very important thing in your life. However, it's very important for anybody who's interested in Athenian history, because Theseus, the great Theseus, the Prince of Athens, was only allowed to go to Crete, where he took on the Minotaur and killed him, on condition he changed his sails from black to white on the way back. Because his father, King Aegeus, was going to sit on the rock of the Acropolis and watch the Bay of Phaleron, and when he saw the white sails coming over the horizon, he knew his son had not been killed or sacrificed to the Minotaur. As we know, Theseus killed the Minotaur. He came back and he forgot to change the sails. And when King Aegeus saw the black sail coming over the horizon, he threw himself off the cliffs. And Theseus arrived in Athens to be proclaimed king. The young Ephebes of Athens, that we're going to talk about later, wore black cloaks in memory of Theseus's forgetfulness. I'm trying to show you that every part of Athenian culture has ramifications and stories and legends attached. When people went to war at sea, naval battles, they were fought by the ordinary hoplite soldiers, except on ships. A bit like, I think they're called Marines, aren't they? Where is Spook? Where is he? Disappeared. Where is he? There he is, yes, exactly. Well, like Marines, right? So they would have their shields and their kit, and they would simply board the opposition's ships and fight on the ships. And because the rowers needed a great deal of water to drink, the ships normally kept pretty close to the shore. Most of the routes, also because they were trading, were close to the shore around the Mediterranean. One very important thing that I want to say right now, and I want you to remember, is the rowers were not slaves. Forget about the Roman films that you've seen in Ben-Hur and Spartacus and all that. In the Greek world, the rowers were very proud of being rowers, like their fathers before them and their grandfathers before them, and they were paid. Possibly one reason why they could withdraw their labor, not that they would want to, and possibly, but please don't hold me to it, one of the factors that might have led to the development of democracy. Now let's look at warfare. I'm starting with the men because obviously I'm doing this hierarchically. And in warfare, everybody went to fight. This is a very famous vase called the Francois Vars, which is in Florence, and it shows you a phalanx formation of battle. And it shows you the men marching into battle to the sound of the double aulus, which is this flute here, this wooden flute, which had an oboe sort of sound. So you see them here, and they're wearing helmets, and they are wearing breastplates and greaves, and they're carrying the great big heavy shield that weighs 12 pounds, as I told you yesterday, and they are meeting their enemy on the battlefield. Now, when you held your shield like that, part of your shield would protect the person beside you, right? You were locked in a formation. There was a tendency, human nature, to creep behind. I think we should shut the door because it's too late now. So there's a tendency to move behind your neighbour's shield, obviously, as you approach. And there's a story of two battle lines missing altogether as they both shifted sideways. So the warfare of the Hoplite Phalanx was the way that war was fought, but that's not always the way it's shown on the vases. And the thing was, there is a real Corinthian helmet. And this was a totally vicious piece of kit because, as you can see, there are no holes for the ears, and you couldn't hear who was coming up behind you. And what's more, you couldn't see because, you know, when you have glasses, they've got to be quite close to your eyes. If they're out here, you can't see. So the front of the helmet was far away from, they couldn't see and they couldn't hear, and they didn't have any springing inside the helmet. And of course, warfare always happened in summer. Many people would die of heat exposure and exhaustion. They looked frightening, but they were really awful. And we can see that a lot of people have written theses on the psychological isolation of warriors in ancient warfare. And that's a real one in the British Museum. We can also see it's actually in action. I'll just go back. You see this shape of this kind of rim here, and that, well, you can see it absolutely exactly on this, which is a frieze on the Siphonian treasury at Delphi, dated 525 BC. The cuirass was another piece of kit, which was primarily possibly for show, because it didn't really stop a spear thrust. It wasn't thick enough. And Hans van Wies, who I used to know really well, has written a whole book called Status Warriors on the fact that the warriors wore this armor for glamour and status and power and prestige, far more than for protection. So this is an archaic cuirass. Now, the big thing was you had to go. You had to go to war. And here we have a young man, beautiful, toned, fit. He's been in that gymnasium, as I told you yesterday, every day, wrestling in the sand. And now he's going to put his life on the line for his beloved city, Athens. Here is his helmet down here. He's got three. The reason for the crest was partly so you could identify your friends in the battle, a bit like the arms that medieval knights carried. And his wife is about to give him a sword. His father's here. Two of them, they're all arming up. They've got their greaves. He's putting on his greaves, and they're going to go to war. Now, you couldn't say, actually, I've got a headache. Don't think I'll go. Actually, it's worse than that. I'm writing this great play. It's about a girl who gets walled up alive and for burying her brother. And I'm thinking of calling it Antigone. And I really can't risk not finishing it. Everybody went to war. Everybody. I mean, Aeschylus, the great man who wrote the Oresteia, he went to war. In fact, his very first play was the Persians. It'd be a bit like fighting in the war for England and then writing your first play on the Second World War from the German point of view. But anyway, you went to war. Now, before you went to war, you had to look and see if the gods were on your side. And you did that by inspecting the liver of a sacrificed animal. And you can see the father saying, I think it looks really good, my son. I don't think you've got a thing to worry about. Because look here, you see there's this and that and so on. And you can see all the shapes and marks on the liver. Yes, come right down here. Do come here. These chairs are much more comfortable. Just come here. You'll be so much more comfortable. Yeah, that's absolutely much better for you. No, please. So that they used to tell the auguries by watching the flight of birds. I mean, it's as good as any, isn't it? If the bird flew to the right, facing north, it was victory, and if to the left, it was defeat. Well, that right and left goes right through into Christian thinking, into Christian art. It's very much embedded in Greek iconography and philosophy. But anyway, so it was normally portrayed as a duel on the vases. And in the archaic age, battles were described as duels between great heroes, as in the Iliad. And here you can see the attitude of domination of the foot on the back of the leg, and this position called the knee-lav position, which is an attitude of submission. So this will show that the winner is moving to the right. This is the direction of victory, and on this side, the side of defeat, as I've just told you, moving to the right. Another scene of a fixed set duel going on here between Ajax with the prince of Troy, who is Prince Hector, my particular favorite Hector, over the body of Patroclus. And it's a wonderful black figure of art. And you can see that you can see that Hector has got body armor on his thighs. And this was the earlier style when these hoplites were more heavily armed. So that's a wonderful black figure vase. You can still see the same helmet there, the huge big heavy shield. But I just want to mention marathon. Now I hope you've all got your Kleenexes and your tissues handy. It's in 490, and 9 years before that, the Athenians had bravely and with great moral rectitude supported an island off the coast of Persia, Turkey as it is. And for that, the Persian king was not going to let Athens get away with it. So he mounted the biggest force the world had ever seen, and he couldn't cross the Bosphorus. I'm afraid traitors come into stories a lot, a traitor from Samos, who was a great engineer, thought of a bridge that would float, a floating bridge, and built it. And the bridge got washed away in a storm, and the Persian king had the sea whipped, sent slaves down and whipped the sea. Now, the sea is a god. Poseidon, you do not whip the sea. And forever afterwards, the Greek claimed that their victory was not their victory. It was because the Persians whipped the sea. Anyway, 9 years later, 490, the Persians arrive at Marathon, and we've got about 8,000 Athenians who are really farmers, with about 900 Plataeans who are also farmers, with no horses, no chariots, and no heavy body armor, to face about 125 Persians and allies, and with horses and chariots. Well, they didn't stand a chance. There was a great argument to what to do. And Miltiades, the great hero of Marathon, said, we're just going to do what we do. We're going to fight. Well, what else can we do? And of course, they left Athens unprotected. So they did something absolutely extraordinary. They lined up in a very, very thin line across the battlefield of Marathon, which I have walked every step of, with a heavy heart, actually quite a joyful heart in the end, and they just moved. And as they came to within about 200 yards of the enemy, they ran. Well, the Persians had never, ever, ever seen an enemy that ran at them. They'd always seen enemies that ran away. So they turned and fought each other, and they killed each other. The centre of the Greek line gave way, sadly, but the wings, the sides kept going, and they were encircled, and they were pushed back into the sea. Some of the ships were captured, and 192 heroes, Greek heroes, fell in that battle, and they're still buried on the battlefield in a place called the Soros, which means the place in Greek. It used to be called something else, the Topos. So that battle was absolutely extraordinary victory, but they realized, because a lot of the Persians had retreated to the ships, that they would sail back down to Athens, and Athens was unprotected. So what did they do? After an entire day of fighting on the battlefield of Marathon, without time to do anything, even bury their dead or anything, they had to do a run, a tremendous run at high speed from Marathon to Athens, and that is the Marathon. That was it wasn't one person that ran back, the entire army ran back. So Marathon is one of the great things, and that gave Athens the confidence, and it is one of the reasons that the Parthenon is so great, as you'll hear tomorrow, I hope, God willing. There were 5 great battles, that's only the first one of it, and there were 5 great battles, and the Athenians won every one of them. In the last great battle, the allied forces against the king of Persia, the great king, was led by a commander, the entire allied group, the commander Pausanias, who was Spartan, and he was 20 years old. I mean, they were quite incredible. So here you have a very nice black figure showing you what carrying one of your dead comrades off the battle might have looked like, and this shows you Ajax carrying Achilles off the battlefield. I will be talking about battle quite a lot because it is the thing that really made Athens, it was the victories that gave them the confidence. This is a detail just to show you what the black figure technique looks like when combined with a little bit of polychrome, and it's an intaglio technique. All of this would have been glazed solid black, and then with a sharp point, the patterning would have been cut out. So it's quite a painstaking process, and you're not going to get very fluid lines as you do in the red figure. Because this is a heroic image of the archaic age, you will see that he's wearing body armor on his thigh as well. So let's move on now to, well, we have to mention death. It's very infrequently shown on the vases. I don't think people want to consider it very much. And this is a very famous crater. It's been given back by America to Rome, to the Villa Giulia, and it's a lovely calyx crater, and it shows the death of Sarpedon. And he is being lifted up by hypnos meaning sleep, so get hypnotherapy, hypnos meaning sleep, and thanatos, death. And here is Hermes, who is the psychopomp, who is the god that leads people to the other world with his caduceus, and he is going to lead Sarpedon. What I wanted to show you is that the body has been pierced in many places and blood is flowing. And ancient warfare was a lot worse than modern warfare. There's no question of a quick bullet, and that was that. It was all bladed weapons, and people died of loss of blood. And most of those people in today's world, of course, probably would have survived. This was the big thing. The Greeks would have absolutely, I mean, they simply couldn't have come to terms with the idea that you can press a button and drop a bomb, or fly over a country and drop something on people that are sleeping in their beds. I mean, they deplored archery. There's no question of any Greek using a bow and arrow or having any archers in their army. But the Scythian Persians had archers. The Scythian archers, all these archers from these Near Eastern countries, because it was cowardly. You could shoot, you could kill somebody from a distance. Now, let's do the fun thing. When they were home, if they survived, which a lot of them obviously did, they had parties called symposia. And, symposia were very wonderful because it was at symposia where people exchanged ideas. And it was also at symposia where people relaxed, had a good time, got to know each other, and where the community and the society bonded. So here you see a symposium in action on a rather nice red figure calyx by the foundry painter, or tributed, let's say, to the foundry painter, from about 480, and it shows people drinking from these very big flat cups, playing the double aulos. And at these symposia, you had these, they're called clines. These couches are called clines. Clines arranged in a U shape in a room called the andron. That's what the calyx looks like, and of course it's a beautifully shaped, balanced. I mean, I think Greek pottery is simply the finest that's ever been made, because the balance and the composition of these vases, and the fact that they tell the stories. So the andron, the symposium would go on, and the drinking was very carefully controlled, because the wine was always mixed with water, and the wine was mixed with water 1 to 4, 1 of wine to 4 of water, which meant that you could drink quite a lot of it, a bit like beer. And you would have music and you'd have singing, but most of all you'd have discussions. What is the most important thing to talk about? Perhaps it's love. One of the records we have of a symposium is the discussion of love by Plato. So you can go away and get Plato's Symposium on love. What is maybe the second most important thing? Statecraft. Should we have an aristocracy, a plutocracy, the rule of the rich, an oligarchy? Should we have a theocracy, the rule of the priesthood? No, it's a very bad idea. What about a democracy, the rule of the people? Now, the very idea that power could be vested, or rather that the people could be trusted with the power of the city-state, was a huge shift at the end of the 6th century from a whole culture that had been fundamentally aristocratic. And the empowerment, of course it was a limited democracy, it certainly wasn't like our democracy, any more than the games are like our democracy, but the shifting the power, the responsibility to the community, bonded that community, and of course democracy was born. Now, you would often sit on the cline with your friend who'd be a younger boy. This is the Erastes with his eromenos, and he's got hair on the edge of his cheek. So when the fluffy beard begins to appear, boys were at their most attractive. This vase, which is called a psicta, would have sat inside a much bigger one, which had cold water. It was a way of cooling the wine. So conversations, and this arrangement of the Erasmus Erastes was a sort of pedagogic one, where the young man would be taught and trained about all kinds of things. So here we have the same thing, 2 people, and the older man, who might have been only 24, 25, is playing kottabos. He's swinging his wine cup around, and he's going to launch the wine into the middle of the room. I'm going to tell you in a minute a little bit more about how it's done. This picture that you can see here is in the center of one of the drinking cups. So you can imagine wine and drinking and conversation and dance. This is a really beautiful one by the Brygos painter, who I love. Brygos is one of the greatest. And this delicate girl is dancing, I think we can say, from her hair, which is short, and from her chiton, and the very fact she's there is that she's probably a slave girl. And we'll see here a knobbly stick with a hoop on the top. That stick's very important. I want to just mention something quickly now, that the archaic age, the men are defined by their armor, as I've tried to tell you, yes? And they will be seen holding their spears on the vases. And even when they're playing dice, I took that out because I had too many, even when they're playing dice, they have their spears right there. They never parted from their armor and their spears, which define them as heroes. When democracy is born, the Athenian people ceded the right of self-defense to the state, the city-state. That was an incredibly big step to take. Consequently, the spear disappears from the vases and is replaced by the knobbly stick with which they vote in the ecclesia. I think that there are certain countries that we know very well who have never done that. America, for one. They've never ever ceded their right of self-defense to the society and trusted the society to look after them. So that's a big, big thing that Athens did. Now, kottabos, as I said, the men were the only official guests, but there were girls, the unofficial guests. And they were girls quite often Corinthian, said through gritted teeth by the Athenian wives, because those Corinthian girls, they had a trick or two up their sleeves. And they were the hetairai, the companions, the courtesans. And here it shows how talented. I mean, look at this girl. You throw away your bra, you're sliding downhill. Well, you're sliding backwards downhill, doing Pilates, trending, and playing Kottabos. Incredibly talented. So what you did with Kottabos, you tipped your wine, you threw your wine into the center of the room in order to drown a saucer that would be floating in a thing called the luterion, a big bowl of water. You had to drown the saucer with the dregs. Well, it was a childish game. But, you had that on the one hand, and you had the discussion of algebra or something going on the other side. In the middle of the room, the wine was mixed with water, handed out by the hetairai, and they haven't got hair curlers, they've got leaves in their hair, reeds. But you can see the tables, the furniture, Greek furniture is very beautiful and very, very heavily decorated. Here you can see a bit of a klein, which would have been inlaid with ivory. Now, ivory became a very big thing as the Athenian Empire grew, and trade from places like North Africa brought ivory and trunks, elephant trunks, into Athens. And ebony and ivory and gold inlaid on these wonderful furnitures. You can see that he's throwing back, there you can see the slight hair on his chin, and the girl playing the double aulus and all those wonderful quarter tones. But they could also be playing a barbiton or indeed a lyre. And this lyre is being played, or barbiton, with a plectrum, exactly like my sons played their guitars. But what's really clever, a little trick my sons never learned, was that the plectrum has a leather thong which is tied onto a convenient little peg down there. So if you were singing and you dropped it by mistake, you just picked it up and carried on. My sons, on the other hand, left all their plectra hidden in the back of the sofa. I'm still finding them from time to time. The thing was, at the end of the party, you had to get the girl, and you took the girl on a wonderful thing called a komos, which meant you went out and tore up the town in the early hours of the morning. And you see that I've pointed out the wrist grip, which is actually part of the wedding ritual, but I don't think that marriage was on the cards tonight. I mean, the eye contact in that image is very aggressive. It's not exactly, particularly combined with the stick that I've just mentioned right across her breast. So the komos could be quite rowdy, and it was a big komos going on the night before the Sicilian expedition set out from Athens, which was the tragic defeat of the Athenian army. The night before the Athenian expedition went out, there was a big, big partying in the city, and the herms were all desecrated. And they all had their genitals knocked off, which was a very big, terrible thing to do. And many people thought it was that caused the Athenians to be overwhelmed in Syracuse and in Sicily. So love gifts. Well, when you had in love with a girl, you can imagine, you're not saying, darling, I've got this lovely diamond ring for you. I really hope you like it. Actually, darling, I've got you a beautiful cockerel. And she'd say, oh, I think he's lovely. And meanwhile, he's pecking her and scratching her. So the cockerel was a gift of choice, a love gift. And I think she's rather pretty. She's got very archaic eye. It's the archaic eye, the eye that looks straight out at you. But love gifts were also, of course, given to boys. And on this very, very famous bill crater by the Berlin painter, so he's quite early, first 10 years of the 5th century, you see Zeus, who's pursuing Ganymede on the other side of the vase. I mean, look at the balance of these figures, the composition. The parallel lines, the parallel line there, and then underscored by the arm, and the line of the beard exactly the same. The composition, when you look at them, and then here, when you go a bit closer, beautiful Ganymede. So there's Ganymede holding up the cockerel again. And as you see, he's blonde, just by the way. So now we have one other element of the wine parties, that some of the cups had eyes, and that was to warn you that alcohol is dangerous, because when you drank what you drank, you might see something at the bottom of the cup which would give you a bit of a warning. But by the time you saw it, you drank the wine. And you might see something like this. And here's a boy who's not used to responsible partying, and he's coming out of a symposium. And the interesting thing about the vase, also Brygos, in fact it's the center of the vase I just showed you, is that the handles were put on at a slope, so when you lifted the vase, he lurched forward. Now, the Greeks had a great sense of humor, and they did that sort of thing a lot. Now, I talked about them a lot yesterday, so I'm not going to talk about them very much, but their lives were centered on going to the gymnasium, the palæstra, preparing for war, preparing for the games, and bonding with each other. And you had, here's a pentathlete, as I think I showed you. In case anybody was not here, the weights for long jumping, the discus, and the javelin training. And I love this particularly. This is a wonderful vase by the Penthesilea painter. It's the center of the Penthesilea painter's plate. It's absolutely beautiful. And I couldn't get a clear one in color, but I think the black and white works fine. And you see these two boys who are so proud, who are so confident, their chests full of the breath of God. They've got their spears, 2 spears each, of course, hair long and glossy, all curled and falling down their chests, their horses, their beloved horses, who are as young as they are, and they're about to cut their hair and lay it on this altar as an offering. The cutting of hair is a symbolic thing that boys did. And boys from about the age of 16 to 18 were sent away from Athens to the outskirts of Attica for 2 years. What a good idea. They did all the naughty things somewhere else. And while they were there, they were trained to be men. They were taught. They were taught, warcraft and everything for 2 years. And then they gave an oath to protect the fatherland, the motherland, and then they came back and joined the army at the age of 19. Now you see that they've combed their hair down in front of their ears to look as if they've got a beard, but they haven't. So they're young teenagers full of the joys of life. And it was boys like that went out and fought those great battles. So it's all about horses, as I told you yesterday. What I didn't tell you is where they came from. The horses came from the north part, like northeast Assyria. There are valleys up there in the northern part of Persia. These great big Nicaean horses came down. And the Greeks bred horses and they exported horses to places like Spain. But look at the horses and the riding, all bareback, of course. Now tomorrow, and I do hope every single one comes tomorrow on time, because tomorrow you're going to see the great horses of the Parthenon, which are quite simply the greatest antiquities in the world. I think horses are extraordinary, and this mystique of the horse has really captured generations and generations of people for centuries. Here they are on this lovely black figure vase. I get the impression that these young Ephedes lived with the horses a bit like friends, because you see how the horses are just sort of among them, sitting on a chair. The horses aren't tied up to poles or anything. So they had a very relaxed relationship with animals generally, and they believed that all animals could cohabit with human beings, unlike the world that we inhabit. There didn't seem to be a fear of animals. They had tame snakes, they had tame geese, they had all kinds of tame animals. And with horses, of course, they trained them. Here you see them being trained. Now, I can go past this. This was yesterday. Somebody's won a wreath and a palm frond, and his friend is giving him a big handshake for being really successful in his particular class. Now, what about women? Well, women were largely hidden away in their houses, and they didn't really see many people, not even the men, in their own families. But they were completely in charge of the oikos, or the family home. This veil-lifting gesture tells us that she is the bride of this young man who is going off to war. Women had to marry, there was no question. every single woman married. You had to marry at about the age of 15 to 18. Up to the age of puberty, you were a child, you ran in races, a sort of particular, there was a kind of girls' initiation place at Brauron, but after puberty, you would grow up and then you would be married. And when you were a wife, you had huge responsibilities. You had to obviously have the next generation of children. You had to run the oikos, and above all, you had to take part in and run the religious processions and festivals that happened almost every day, and do various other things, particularly weave. This is rather nice. It shows you flower arranging, playing with a pet canary, chatting to your friend. This one looks like a bride. And this particular vase is called a Lutrophorus, and it was used for washing brides before a wedding, but also for washing bodies after they died. And there's an enormous amount of parallels between the rituals of marriage and the rituals of death. And someone's written a book on that, of course. So you look at it, and it's on this rather strange thing that looks like a Provençal roof tile. It's called an epinetron, and you put it on your thigh and knee so that you wouldn't mess up your keton or your peplos while you were spinning and carding wool. And you can see that it's got the scenes that would interest a woman all the way around. This is another vase particularly used for women here. I think the flower arranging is rather nice, don't you think? People still love, I certainly do. Weaving, well, everybody had to weave. And for women, the weaving was their language. They could weave stories and patterns into their cloth. And there's stories about the cloth coming back decades later and somebody recognizing her own story. There are legends about women trying to save their sister by sending a cloth with a message in. So the weaving of cloth was something very much in the hands of women. And that's the whole bit of this black figure. You could see that they had to pile this is the wool, in a thing called a calathos. Weaving was their life. And of course, Athena is a goddess of weaving. Here you see Penelope. She wove her loom, and at night she pulled it out, because she'd said that when the thing was finished, she would choose a suitor. Now, women they went to the fountain house. Lots of myths, or legends rather, circulate around the fountain house because it was dangerous for a girl to go from her oikos to the public fountain house. She had to go through the male gaze and walk through an effectively male space. The women I'm talking about would never go to the agora. It was the slaves who would do the shopping, or the women of the fields, but not the patrician women of Athens. But this is rather a lovely scene, and it's on a vase known as a hudria, which I'd shown you the whole thing, with handles on the outsides, a big round vase, carried on the head on a pad, obviously very, very heavy, and at the fountain house with a tame deer. I have so many wonderful stories about animals and their relationships in these very ancient times. I've got another one showing the woman sort of hiding behind one of the columns of the fountain house. Now, there was family life, as there is always, a scene of a mother with a baby and the young husband visiting, and another woman being shown the absolutely de rigueur jewelry box. De rigueur, and on the other side, this is the calathos, the basket for the wool. So jewelry, wool, and normally mirrors, because women are so vain. There's no mirrors in that one. And children could have quite a lot of fun. Here we have a little boy being put on a swing by his dad, and the children appear a great deal. I'm just 1 second, because I'm extremely cold. I'm going to put this on, please, if you don't mind. I hope you'll still be able to hear. I'm freezing. I don't know. Whoops. Let's see. I don't know. Now, do you think you'll still hear? Can you hear me or not? Yeah? Okay, good. Thanks. I'm really chilly. Yes, so there are lots of... Now, this is an oinoikoi, which has got three lips for pouring wine out, that way, that way. You're going to see a lot of those. Children babies, you see them crawling on these little wine pots. The wine pots have got 3 pouring points, so you could pour like that, or like that, and they were for babies. There was this great wine drinking festival, and everybody drank wine, including children, from the age of 3. They were allowed to have their own little wine mug, and everybody drank wine at this festival. So these are very tragic little pots, because they were put in the graves of children who did not live long enough to enjoy this festival or have their own little wine pot. So the little wine jug, here's a little person with a little wheel that he could pull along, and they wore a string with bells and magic charms so Mum would know where they were. Here's another one crawling along, and this one with a little bird and a puppy, and the one I didn't put in, I think I've got another one, with a tame goose. They were not frightened of animals. Nobody put the fear of animals into them. And they loved dogs. There are all kinds of dogs. The children have these little puppies I've just shown you, like that, little sort of fluffy Maltese thing. And the men have big hunting dogs, and the adults at the symposia take their dogs to the party. And warriors take their dogs. And when Themistocles, I'll probably tell you this tomorrow, when Themistocles orders the evacuation of Athens in 480, that's 10 years after Marathon, everybody out. The Persian army is descending, all the men on the ships and everybody else to Salamis. There's a story of, as the men get on the ships, a dog that swims next to the boat all the way to Salamis because his beloved human friend on it. They had an amazing relationship with animals. They believed all animals could cohabit, could live with men. Women also were in charge of mourning rites and funeral rites. And you see here's a young man. They've put a strap under his chin to keep his jaw up and probably put a coin in his mouth to pay Charon, who was the person who took the boat across the river Styx. Can you hear me, by the way? Yeah, fine. Good. And this is called the Prothesis, and this young man is dying very young. We don't know why, whether he died in war or not. So when you would lie in state like that for 3 days, and then the body would be put on a cart, and the cart would go through the city with a lot of singing or crying and wailing out to the cemetery, and the cemeteries were always outside the city gates, always. Necropolis was beyond city gates. And some of these funerals became so lavish that the authorities had to limit them because it was being used as a way of extravagant displays of wealth. Now, a woman appearing here on a very nice white ground, lekithos, with another woman who is not a child. So who do you think she could be? She is an adult woman carrying a box which has probably got jewelry or folded up clothes in, and the woman here is holding a piece of weaving, something special, with the word it's kalos, and the mirror. And who is that woman? You want to go on, say it? Very good. Who said slave? Very, very good. Oh, I've said it. Well, then you're not good at all. No, I'm sorry. Okay. Now, it's the sort of thing, this is why my students love me, because I'm so easy to bamboozle. Anyway, you're quite right. So she's a slave, and she's got this short haircut, typical of a slave. And this is a lekithos, and these vases were used to be placed on graves. So here you can see it, right? There it is. And that's another kind of thing that was used. So these vases were placed, and that's an alabastron with perfume, on the graves. And we've got so many of them because they were solid. They were solid so they didn't break up. And because they were on graves, they got mixed up with the earth and they disappeared into graves. And so we got lots. That's very bad, because that means our sample of evidence for life and the preoccupations of the Athenians is slanted towards funerary imagery on funerary vases simply because they survived. Got it? Got it? Okay. And why did they survive? They survived because there it is, you can see it. There are many of them, hundreds of them, and they're white ground because they weren't used, they weren't handled much, and they survived because they were solid. They just had a little piece in the middle that was hollow, and olive oil was put in there. I mean, you're not going to go out and waste a litre of the best olive oil and put it out in the cemetery where somebody's just going to walk off with it and probably market it and sell it. So they just put little oil in, solid. That means they survive. I mean, one of the beauties of pottery, and I'm showing you beautiful complete vases, but there are thousands of fragments, is the fact is that the broken pottery is useless. And because broken pottery is useless, it survives. And because it survives, it's useful to us for iconography and all kinds of research. So it's really the uselessness of the broken pottery that's so useful. This is a little pyxis, and here a girl is being taken, the very same wrist strip there, out to her new home. She looks very unhappy about it, as well she may be. She was pretty much traded by her father. I'm sure the parents chose nice husbands. And then she went on a cart like that to her new home. Now, there is quite a lot of evidence the women could also read, and this is a lekithos showing a woman reading a scroll. So I just put that in to show you a bit of the other side of it. And all their jewel boxes. They obviously have tons of jewels. You never see them without their jewel boxes. And she's being offered jewels because she's a bride. Now, yes, and swinging. There was obviously quite a lot of fun to be had. That's a black figure vase, so it's pretty rigid. And the child is shown with the proportions of an adult, because they didn't understand that children's proportions were different in the black figure period. This is a red figure vase, which shows much more movement, again, a girl swinging. So this was just the everyday life of women, of men that went to war, of the young youths, and of the babies. Now, the women were also the great followers of Dionysos. Dionysos was a god of the mask, of wine, and of the theatre, of drama, and he was an ecstatic god. And you can see his eye looks rather white, and he looks spaced. I think that's the right expression. And he's got the sacred ivy, which is poisonous, around his head, and the panther skin, or the leopard skin, around him. Now, the following of Dionysus was a dangerous thing. Only women went up to Mount Parnassus. This happened every 2 years. Obviously, somebody knows about this. Every 2 years, in the middle of winter, they wrapped themselves up in all their woolen cloaks, and they walked 80 miles to Mount Parnassus. They went up to Mount Parnassus, above Delphi, and high in the mountains. They indulged in these monadic rites. Now, the only people that have written about the monadic rites are men. And it can't escape your notice that it's in the interest of the men to portray these rites as very wild and out of control. Most famously, we have the play written by Euripides, the Bacchae. That play, the Bacchae, portrays what happens if a man tries to take part in these rites. King Pentheus dresses as a woman and is ripped to bits by his own mother. They allegedly get drunk, they beat drums, they rip animals to bits, they drink the hot blood, they go into an ecstatic state of union with the god. But it only happens every 2 years, and in a sense justifies women being locked up for the rest of the time. The monadic rites are mysterious, and I'm not too sure how wild they were. They are certainly portrayed as very wild on the vases. I know there's much, much more I could say about this, and it might come in a bit tomorrow, but I'm not sure. Maenads, wearing animal skins, becoming wild, all that uncontrolled wildness of the woman released. Women took part in the festivals and the religious observances, and one of which would have been the sacrifices. And this vase shows the sacrifice of a bull, and you can see that he's being given a bowl of water. Now that's very sad, because in the Greek way of thinking, and I hope you're going to listen to this because it goes right through our culture, I would say, that the animal or the sacrifice had to be a consenting sacrifice. You couldn't just say, I'm going to sacrifice a sheep, I'm going to sacrifice a goat. The goat, the sheep, the bull had to consent to die. The god is not interested in a forced sacrifice. And of course, it was Iphigenia who struggled like a goat just before the allies took off to sail to